The day my own son stole $68 million from me, I did not cry because of the money. I cried because I realized the little boy I had raised with love no longer existed. If you think this story is about a fortune, you are wrong. It is about betrayal, family, and the painful moment a father discovers that the child he trusted more than anyone has become a stranger. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next changed my life forever. My name is John Carter. I am 72 years old, and for almost 50 years I built my transportation company from a single-use truck into a business worth more than $68 million. I did not build it to become famous. I built it so my family would never struggle the way I did when I was young after my wife passed away. My only reason for waking up every morning was my son, Michael. He was my greatest achievement, not my company. I taught him to work hard, to respect people, and to value honesty more than money. As a young boy, he followed me through the warehouse, wearing a tiny hard hat while the employees laughed and called him the future boss. Those memories became the happiest moments of my life. As he grew older, I trusted him with more responsibility because I believed one day I would hand him the company with pride. Every employee respected him, and every banker knew his name. If someone had told me back then that Michael would one day destroy everything I spent my life building, I would have defended him without thinking. That is what fathers do. We believe in our children even when the world gives us reasons not to. Then one evening, Michael called me and said, "Dad, I want you to meet someone very important to me." I smiled all the way home because I believed I was finally going to meet the woman who would become part of our family. I had no idea that the beautiful young woman waiting at my dinner table was not looking at me like a future father-in-law. She was quietly looking at everything I owned. When Vanessa smiled at me for the first time, I thought she was entering my family. I never imagined she was entering my life with a plan. I still remember the smile on Michael's face the night he introduced Vanessa to me, and if I am being honest, she made an excellent first impression. She walked into my home, carrying a homemade pie, shook my hand with confidence, and thanked me for inviting her to dinner. Before I could even pull out her chair, she smiled and said, "Mr. Carter, Michael has told me so many wonderful things about you." No, father dislikes hearing words like that. I believed I was looking at the woman who would make my son happy for the rest of his life. During dinner, she listened carefully every time I talked about my late wife, the company, and the difficult years we survived together. She laughed at my stories, complimented the food, and treated me with a level of respect that immediately earned my trust. When she noticed an old family photograph hanging on the wall, she stood there for several minutes studying it before quietly saying, "You built an incredible family." Those words touched my heart more than she could have known. The end of the evening, I hugged Michael and whispered, "Son, you chose well." I wish I had never said those words. Looking back now, I realize Vanessa hardly asked Michael any questions that night. Most of her attention stayed on me. She wanted to know how long I planned to keep running the company, how many employees worked for us, and whether Michael would eventually become the owner. I answered every question without hesitation because they sounded like normal conversations between family members. I even joked that one day I hoped to retire and spend my mornings fishing while Michael handled everything. She smiled, but there was something unusual about the way her eyes lit up when I mentioned retirement. I noticed it for only a second, then ignored it because I wanted to believe she genuinely cared about our future. That single moment would haunt me for years. After dinner, as Michael drove her home, I stood at the front window smiling, like a proud father. Honestly believed God had blessed my family one more time. I had absolutely no idea that the sweetest smile I had ever welcomed into my home would slowly become the most dangerous lie I had ever trusted. 3 weeks later, Vanessa asked Michael to do something so small it seemed harmless, and that was the first mistake my son ever made. 3 weeks after I met Vanessa, I noticed something that should have worried me, but instead it made me feel proud. Michael started coming to the office earlier than usual. He asked to attend meetings he had never shown interest in before. He requested copies of financial reports, investment summaries, and long-term business plans. Smiled every time he knocked on my office door, because I believed my son was finally preparing to take over the company. "Dad, I want to learn everything while you are still here," he told me one morning. No father could refuse words like those. I opened every door for him, introduced him to our attorneys, our accountants, and our senior managers. I even gave him limited authority to approve routine company transactions so he could gain experience before I retired. The employees admired his enthusiasm, and I felt proud watching him grow into a leader. What I did not know was that none of these ideas belonged to Michael. They belonged to Vanessa. She encouraged him every single night. She convinced him that if he wanted to become a successful businessman, he needed complete access to every part of the company. At first, it sounded reasonable. Then the questions became more personal. She wanted to know how my estate was structured, who controlled the trust, and what would happen to the company if I suddenly became ill. Michael repeated those questions to me as though they were his own, answered them because I trusted him completely. Never imagined someone outside. My family was quietly collecting every answer one evening, while Michael stepped outside to answer a phone call. Vanessa looked around my study and smiled. "You built all of this by yourself," she said. I nodded. She walked closer to the shelves where decades of company awards were displayed, and then she asked, "Have you ever thought about retiring sooner than planned?" I laughed and told her I still had a few good years left in me. She smiled politely, but for just a brief second, the warmth disappeared from her face. It was gone so quickly that I convinced myself I had imagined it. I should not have ignored that moment, because from that day forward, Michael slowly stopped asking how I was feeling and started asking how much control I still had over my own company. The next request Michael made sounded completely harmless, but it became the first step toward losing $68 million. A few days later, Michael knocked on my office door carrying 2 cups of coffee. He smiled the same way he used to when he was a little boy, asking me for a new bicycle. "Dad, I want to understand the business completely before you retire," he said. "Would you trust me with a little more responsibility?" Those words filled me with pride. Had waited years to hear them. I believed my son was finally ready to carry the family legacy. I called our chief financial officer into the room and asked him to expand Michael's access to a few company systems. It was nothing unusual. Could review reports, approve routine payments, and attend meetings that had previously been reserved for senior executives. Everyone agreed it was the natural next step. I had no idea I was slowly unlocking doors that should have remained closed. After work, Michael thanked me with a hug and said, "Dad, I promise I will never let you down." Those words stayed in my mind for days because they reminded me of the little boy who once promised to take care of me when I became old. What I did not know was that every evening, after leaving the office, Michael shared everything he learned with Vanessa. She celebrated every new permission he received as though they had both earned it. She kept telling him, "Your father already trusts you more than anyone else. Now you only have to prove you can handle even bigger responsibilities." Michael believed she was encouraging him to become a better businessman. He never realized she was encouraging him to move one step closer to complete control. One Friday evening, I invited them both to dinner again. Everything seemed perfect. We laughed, talked about future vacations, and even discussed Michael and Vanessa's wedding. Looked across the table and silently thanked God for giving my son someone who appeared to love him as much as I did. I could not see what was happening behind the smiles. I did not notice the quick glances they exchanged every time the company was mentioned. I did not notice Vanessa quietly steering every conversation back toward money, ownership, and the future of my estate. I believed I was watching 2 young people plan a happy life together. In reality, they were quietly planning something else entirely. The following week, Vanessa convinced Michael to ask me for one signature, and that single signature changed everything. The next Monday, Michael walked into my office carrying a thin folder and a nervous smile. "Dad, I need your signature on a few banking documents," he said. "Nothing important. Our accountants are updating the company's online authorization system, and they need both of our names on the new paperwork. I barely looked at the papers because I trusted my son more than I trusted anyone else in the world. I signed the first page, then the second, and then another without asking many questions. Our chief financial officer was away at a conference that week, and Michael assured me everything had already been reviewed by our legal team. This will make future approvals much easier, he said. I smiled and handed the folder back to him. Before leaving, he thanked me, shook my hand, and quietly said, "You always believe in me, Dad. I will never forget that." Those words warmed my heart. I had no idea they would become one of the most painful memories of my life. Later that evening, I drove home feeling strangely peaceful. I even called an old friend and told him I was finally thinking about retirement. "Michael is ready," I proudly said. "The company will be in good hands." My friend laughed and congratulated me. He told me I had earned the right to slow down for the first time in decades. Believed him. That night, I slept better than I had in years. While I was sleeping, Michael and Vanessa were awake. She sat beside him with a laptop open on the dining table, carefully reviewing every document I had signed. She smiled and whispered, "We are getting closer." Michael looked uncertain for a moment and asked, "Are you sure this is the right thing to do?" Vanessa gently took his hand and replied, "Your father has controlled your entire life. You are only taking what should already belong to you." Those words slowly erased the last bit of doubt from his mind. He closed the laptop, took a deep breath, and nodded. I was sleeping peacefully in my own home, completely unaware that the trust I had given my only son was already being turned into the weapon that would destroy everything I had spent 50 years building. 3 days later, I received a phone call from my bank, and the voice on the other end immediately told me something was terribly wrong. 3 days after I signed those documents, my phone rang just as I was finishing breakfast. I almost ignored the call because I recognized the bank's number and assumed it was another routine confirmation. Instead, a senior banking manager introduced himself and politely asked, "Mr. Carter, did you personally authorize several unusually large account changes this morning?" I smiled and answered, "Of course, my son is helping with a few business updates. Is there a problem?" There was a long silence before he replied, "Sir, we simply wanted to verify the transactions because of their size." I thanked him for being careful and assured him everything was under control. After hanging up, I felt proud that the bank was taking security seriously. I never imagined they had just given me the first opportunity to stop the disaster before it happened. Around noon, I called Michael to ask about the bank's questions. Laughed so naturally that my concerns disappeared within seconds. "Dad, the system automatically flags high-value corporate movements whenever we update account permissions. Do not worry, everything is exactly the way our accountants planned." I apologized for bothering him. He even joked, "You always taught me to double-check everything. Now you are double-checking me." We both laughed, and I ended the call believing I had raised an honest man. That evening, Vanessa invited me to dinner. She thanked me again for trusting Michael and told me he admired me more than anyone else in the world. Hearing those words filled me with peace. I looked across the table and silently thanked God for blessing my son with such a supportive partner. When I returned home, I noticed something unusual. My home office door was slightly open. I rarely left it that way. At first, I thought the cleaning staff had forgotten to close it. But then I realized several file folders on my desk had been moved. Nothing appeared to be missing. So I convinced myself I was imagining things. I closed the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed without another thought. I did not know that while I was sleeping, someone already had access to information that should never have left that room. The next morning, my chief financial officer rushed into my office with a look on his face that I had never seen before, and before he spoke a single word, I knew my life was about to change forever. The moment my chief financial officer walked into my office, I knew something was terribly Wrong. He had worked beside me for more than 20 years, and I had never seen fear on his face. Until that morning, he closed the door behind him without saying a word, placed a thick folder on my desk, and slowly pushed it toward me. Mr. Carter, I think you need to look at this before anyone else does. I opened the folder expecting another financial report, but instead I found copies of bank authorizations, wire transfer requests, and digital approval records. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, I noticed Michael's name appearing again and again beside transactions worth millions of dollars. My heart began beating faster. What exactly am I looking at? I asked. He took a deep breath before answering. For the past several weeks, someone has been restructuring company accounts, changing approval limits, and creating new transfer pathways. Every change was approved using credentials legally connected to Michael's executive access. Immediately defended my son. There has to be a mistake. Michael would never steal from his own father. He nodded respectfully. Sir, I truly hope I am wrong. That is why I came directly to you before contacting anyone else. He then pointed to a series of scheduled transfers that had not yet been completed. If these instructions are real, $68 million could leave the company within the next 24 hours. For a few seconds, I could not breathe. I reached for my phone to call Michael, but my hand stopped. Halfway, I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation. Wanted someone to tell me this was a computer error or a misunderstanding. After everything we had built together, I refused to believe my own son could be standing on the other side of this nightmare. I looked out the office window and whispered to myself, please, Michael, tell me this is not true. I had no idea that, while I was desperately searching for answers, my son and Vanessa were already packing their bags for a flight that would take them thousands of miles away from me. When I finally called Michael, his phone rang once, and then it was switched off forever. I called Michael again, and then a third time. Every call went straight to voicemail. At first, I convinced myself his phone battery had died. He had forgotten to charge it before. Then I called Vanessa. She did not answer either. That was the first moment real fear settled into my chest. I asked my assistant to check Michael's schedule, but she quietly told me he had canceled every meeting that afternoon without giving a reason. I drove straight to his office. His desk was spotless. His laptop was gone. His family photographs had disappeared from the shelves. Even the coffee mug I had given him on his first day at the company was missing. My stomach tightened because people do not clear out their offices unless they know they are not coming back. I rushed to the parking garage. His car was gone. Immediately called airport security through one of my business contacts, hoping I was overreacting. While I waited for a response, my chief financial officer walked into the garage holding his phone. Mr. Carter, the first transfers have already been completed. I felt my knees weaken. How much? He swallowed hard before answering. Almost $22 million has already left the primary accounts, and the remaining transfers are still processing. For a moment, the world around me became completely silent. I was not thinking about the money. I was thinking about my son. The little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder had somehow become the man emptying the company I had spent my entire life building. Then my phone vibrated. A new message appeared from an unknown number. My hands shook as I opened it. There were only 8 words. Dad, please do not look for me. I am sorry. No explanation. No promise to return. Nothing else. I stared at those words until they became blurry through my tears. That was the exact moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding. This had been planned long before I ever signed those documents. Few minutes later, my airport contact called me back, and the information he gave me completely shattered the last hope I had left. My phone felt heavier than it ever had before when my contact at the airport finally spoke. Mr. Carter, I am sorry. Your son and a woman named Vanessa boarded a private flight less than 40 minutes ago. They are already out of the country. For several seconds, I could not answer. simply stared through the office window, while his words echoed in my mind. Out of the country, they had planned everything. They had chosen a destination where they believed I could never reach them. I thanked him, ended the call, and slowly lowered the phone onto my desk. My chief financial officer stood quietly across from me, waiting for instructions, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. He was not looking at a wealthy businessman. He was looking at a father whose heart had just been broken. I walked into Michael's empty office and sat in his chair. The room still smelled like his favorite coffee. Noticed a framed photograph of the two of us had been removed from the shelf, but the outline of the frame was still visible in the dust. That empty space hurt me more than the missing money ever could. I closed my eyes and remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle, helping him with homework, and promising his mother, before she died, that I would always protect our son. I had kept every promise I made. She had not lived long enough to see the man he had become. Then my attorney rushed into the office carrying another folder. "John, we have a much bigger problem," he said. The transfers were not random. They were carefully divided across multiple international accounts, and someone also copied confidential company records before leaving. I looked at him in disbelief. "Are you telling me they planned this for months?" He nodded slowly. "Based on what we are seeing, yes." At that moment, I finally stopped asking myself whether Michael was innocent. That painful hope disappeared forever. I stood up, wiped the tears from my face, and took one deep breath. I still loved my son, but I could no longer protect the man he had chosen to become. Just as I was preparing to call the authorities, my attorney uncovered one document that proved this betrayal had started long before the money disappeared. My attorney placed a single document on my desk and quietly said, "John, you need to prepare yourself before you read this." Picked it up expecting another banking record, but instead I found copies of emails, legal drafts, and financial requests dating back almost 8 months. My hands began shaking as I realized this was never a sudden mistake. It was a carefully planned betrayal. Vanessa had convinced Michael to create shell companies under different names. She had introduced him to financial advisors I had never heard of and persuaded him to move small amounts of money between accounts so nobody would notice. The transfers were tiny at first. They looked like ordinary business expenses, but month after month, the pattern became clearer. Someone had been rehearsing for one final move. My attorney pointed to one email that made my heart sink. Vanessa had written, "Once your father signs the final authorization, we will never have to look back again." Michael had replied with only one sentence: "He trusts me completely." I read those 5 words over and over. They hurt more than every missing dollar combined. I trusted him because he was my son. I never imagined that trust would become the very weapon used against me. My chief financial officer quietly informed me that employees had already begun hearing rumors. Some believed hackers were responsible. Others feared the company was collapsing. Looked through the office windows and saw dozens of loyal people who had spent years helping me build this business. They were worried about their jobs, their families, and their future. At that moment, I made myself one promise. No matter how much pain Michael had caused me, I would not allow innocent employees to suffer because of his choices. I wiped my eyes, walked into the boardroom, and calmly told everyone, "The company is still standing. We will fight this together." They applauded, but none of them knew that inside I felt completely broken. That evening, the police called me with unexpected news. Someone had seen Michael and Vanessa only hours before they boarded their flight, and what they witnessed changed the entire investigation. That night, I expected the police to tell me they had already lost my son's trail. Instead, the lead investigator called and asked me to come to the station immediately. His voice sounded calm, but I could tell something important had happened. When I arrived, he placed several security photographs on the table. The first showed Michael and Vanessa entering the private airport terminal. The second showed them meeting a man I had never seen before. The third made my heart stop. That man handed Vanessa a thick envelope, and only a few seconds later she passed a folder to him. My investigator looked at me and said, "Mr. Carter, this was not a young couple running away with money. This appears to be part of a much larger financial operation." I stared at the photographs in complete silence. Every answer I found only created another question. Who was that man? Why was he waiting at the airport? What was inside the envelope? The investigator explained that the man had already appeared in several international fraud investigations, but they still did not know his real identity. That meant Michael had not simply made one terrible decision. He had been introduced to dangerous people long before the money disappeared. As painful as that realization was, it also gave me a small piece of hope. If criminals were involved, they would eventually make mistakes. On my drive home, I kept remembering the day Michael learned to drive. I had trusted him with my car because I believed he would always make the right choices. Now, I was sitting alone, asking myself where I had failed as a father. When I reached my house, I noticed something unusual. My home security company had left 2 missed calls. Immediately called them back. The manager asked me one simple question. "Mr. Carter, did you authorize anyone to enter your home office 3 nights before the money disappeared?" My heart nearly stopped. I answered, "No." "Why?" There was a long pause before he quietly replied, "Because our cameras recorded someone entering your office after midnight using your son's access code." At that moment, I realized the theft had not started at the bank. It had started inside my own home. The security footage from that night revealed something I never expected to see, and it completely changed the way I looked at my own son. I asked the security manager to play the recording from the beginning because I refused to believe what he had just told me. The video showed my driveway at exactly 12:43 in the morning. A few seconds later, Michael's car slowly pulled in. He stepped out alone, looked around as though he wanted to make sure nobody was watching, and quietly unlocked my front door using the emergency access code I had given him years earlier. Because he was my son, he walked through my house as confidently as if he still lived there. Then he entered my home office. My hands began shaking as I watched him open the filing cabinet where I kept confidential company documents. He carefully removed several folders, took photographs of every page with his phone, and then connected a small portable drive to my computer. I wanted to believe he was copying family records or tax documents, but deep inside I already knew the truth. Then something happened that broke my heart even more. Before leaving, Michael stopped in front of the framed photograph of me and his late mother. He picked it up, looked at it for several seconds, and quietly placed it face down on my desk. I could not explain why that simple act hurt more than the missing millions. It felt as though he had already decided to erase us from his life. The investigator paused the video and zoomed in on the final few seconds just before Michael walked out of the room. His phone rang. He answered immediately, and although there was no audio, the investigators had enhanced the image enough to read part of Vanessa's name on the screen. He smiled, nodded several times, and left the house carrying every document he had copied. Covered my face with both hands because I finally understood that this betrayal had not happened in a single night. It had been carefully prepared for months by the 2 people I trusted the most. The investigator looked at me with sympathy and quietly said, "Mr. Carter, we now know how they planned it. The next step is finding out where they went after leaving the airport." I took a deep breath, wiped the tears from my eyes, and answered, "Then let us find them, because I need to know whether my son still has any conscience left at all." The very next morning, we received a report from overseas, and it proved Michael and Vanessa were already turning my stolen fortune into something far more dangerous. The next morning, my attorney called before sunrise. His voice sounded different, not frightened, determined. "John, we finally found the first overseas transaction." Drove straight to his office without eating breakfast. When I arrived, he spread dozens of financial reports across the conference table and pointed to a series of international wire transfers. "Michael and Vanessa are not keeping the money in one place. They are moving it through several foreign companies every few hours. Some of it has already been converted into luxury real estate private investment funds, and offshore accounts. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. They had only been gone for a few days. Yet it looked as though they had spent months preparing every step. My attorney then showed me something even more painful. One newly registered company listed Michael as its managing director, but the majority ownership belonged to Vanessa. I read the document 3 times because I thought I had misunderstood. My own son had risked everything for a woman who already controlled most of the fortune he stole. My attorney quietly said, "John, I do not think Michael realizes what is happening." At first, I disagreed. I believed he knew exactly what he was doing. Then we uncovered another email sent only hours after they landed overseas. Michael had written, "Vanessa, are you sure we still need to move all the money? I think my father will forgive me if I return home." Her reply was only one sentence. "There is no home for you anymore. Only our future matters." Those words stayed in my mind all day. For the first time, I wondered whether my son had been manipulated more deeply than I ever imagined. Was still guilty. He had betrayed me, and nothing could erase that. But perhaps he had also become a prisoner of the very person he trusted. Most I left my attorney's office, carrying more questions than answers. As I reached my car, my phone rang again. Was the lead investigator. His first words made my heart race. "Mr. Carter, we finally know the real identity of Vanessa, and it is not the name she gave your family." When I heard her real name, I realized my son had never truly known the woman he chose over his own father. I looked at the investigator without saying a single word. He opened a thick file, slid one photograph across the table, and quietly said, "Mr. Carter, the woman you know as Vanessa does not legally exist." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Then he placed 3 different passports beside the photograph. Each passport carried a different name, but every picture belonged to the same woman. My heart sank. He continued, "During the past 12 years, she has used multiple identities in several countries. She has been connected to wealthy businessmen, sudden disappearances of large fortunes, and financial fraud investigations. But every time authorities got close, she vanished before charges could be filed." I could barely breathe. The investigator pointed to another page. "Your son was not her first target. He was simply the latest." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Every family dinner, every smile, every compliment she gave me suddenly felt fake. She had not entered my life because she loved my son. She had entered because she had spent months studying everything I owned. I asked the investigator the only question that mattered. "Does Michael know who she really is?" He looked down at the file before answering. "We honestly do not know. At this point, he may be her partner, or he may be another victim." Those words stayed with me all day. Wanted to hate my son for what he had done, but part of me still remembered the little boy who cried whenever he accidentally stepped on a bird or saw someone in pain. Kept asking myself how that child had become the man who destroyed his own father. Then my attorney rushed into the room carrying his laptop. "John, you need to see this immediately." He opened an international banking report showing that several of the offshore accounts had suddenly been emptied. Again, the money was moving faster than anyone expected. Even stranger, almost none of it was ending up in accounts connected to Michael. Most of it was disappearing into accounts controlled solely by Vanessa. At that moment, I realized a painful truth. My son had betrayed me, believing he would become rich. But the woman he trusted was quietly betraying him as well. Only 2 days later, Michael secretly tried to contact me, and the first words he whispered completely changed everything. 2 nights later, my phone rang at exactly 2:17 in the morning. I almost ignored it because the number was hidden, but something inside me told me to answer. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then I heard a voice I had prayed to hear every single day. "Dad." It was Michael. His voice was shaking. He sounded exhausted, frightened, and nothing like the confident young man who had walked away with $68 million. "Michael, where are you?" I asked, but before I could say another word, he whispered, "Dad, I made the biggest mistake of my life. My heart was racing. Wanted to shout at him. I wanted to ask why he destroyed our family, but all I could hear was my little boy crying on the other end of the phone. He told me Vanessa had changed completely after they arrived overseas. She took control of every account, every password, and every document. She introduced him to men he had never met before and ordered him to sign papers without reading them. When he refused, she reminded him that if he went to the police, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. She kept telling him there was no way back home because nobody would ever forgive him. Then Michael said something that made the blood drain from my face. Dad, I think she never loved me. She only wanted your money. Although my heart was broken, I already knew he was telling the truth. I asked him where he was, but before he could answer, his breathing suddenly changed. Heard a door slam in the background, then a woman's voice shouted something. I could not understand. Michael quickly whispered, "She is coming. I do not have much time. Listen to me carefully. There is something you do not know about the money." The line suddenly went silent. I kept shouting his name, but there was no answer. After several painful seconds, the call disconnected. I stared at the phone, hoping it would ring again. It never did. Immediately called the investigator and told him everything. He traced the call, but it had lasted only a few seconds and had already been routed through multiple countries. It was almost impossible to locate. Sat alone until sunrise, holding the phone in my hand, wondering whether that had been the last time I would ever hear my son's voice. The next afternoon, the investigators uncovered a hidden account that proved Michael had secretly done something Vanessa never expected. The following afternoon, my attorney and the lead investigator asked me to come to the office immediately. The moment I walked in, I knew they had found something important. Attorney turned his laptop toward me and said, "John, we finally discovered an account Vanessa never knew existed." I leaned closer to the screen. There, in front of me, was a hidden investment account that had been opened only 2 days before Michael disappeared. The account contained only a small portion of the stolen money, but what shocked me was the name of the beneficiary. It was not Michael, it was me. My attorney looked into my eyes and quietly said, "Your son secretly moved part of the money into an account that only you could legally access if something happened to him." For several seconds, I could not speak. I had spent days believing Michael's conscience had completely disappeared. But this single discovery told a different story. It did not erase what he had done. He had still betrayed me. He had still broken my heart. But somewhere inside him, the little boy I had raised was still fighting to do one right thing. The investigators searched deeper into the account records and uncovered several encrypted messages Michael had saved before leaving. One sentence stood out above all the others. "If I cannot fix what I have done, at least my father will not lose everything." My eyes filled with tears because those words sounded like the son I remembered, not the man who had walked away with $68 million. The investigator believed Michael had created the account after realizing Vanessa's true intentions. He had quietly hidden part of the fortune before she could take complete control. That meant he had already begun planning a way to protect me without letting her know. I finally understood why he sounded terrified during our phone call. He was no longer running beside Vanessa. He was trapped with her. I looked at the investigator and asked the question that had been haunting me for days. "Is my son still alive?" He paused before answering. "We believe he is. But if Vanessa discovers what he did, she will see him as a threat instead of a partner." Those words hit me harder than anything else. I had heard I had already lost my trust. I refused to lose my son as well. Only a few hours later, we received an emergency message from overseas, and it proved Michael was in far greater danger than any of us had imagined. Only a few hours after we discovered the hidden account, my phone rang again. This time it was not Michael. It was the lead investigator calling from overseas. "Mr. Carter, we believe your son is in immediate danger." My heart almost stopped. He explained that local authorities had found a rental vehicle abandoned near a private marina. Inside the car were Michael's passport, a broken mobile phone, and a small notebook covered with handwritten notes. At first, the notebook looked ordinary. Then one detective noticed my name written across several pages. When they translated the notes, my hands began shaking. Michael had written, "If anything happens to me, tell my father I am sorry. I should have listened to him. I thought I was stealing a fortune, but I was really giving my life to the wrong person. I closed my eyes because those words sounded exactly like the little boy I had raised, the investigator continued. We also found evidence that Vanessa emptied nearly every remaining account without telling Michael. She disappeared only a few hours before he did. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized my son was no longer chasing the money. He was chasing the woman who had betrayed him. He had lost his fortune, his freedom, and almost his entire future because he trusted the wrong person. Wanted to be angry, but all I could picture was Michael sitting somewhere alone, realizing he had destroyed the only family that truly loved him. My attorney then received another update from international banking officials. One final transfer had been attempted only minutes earlier, but it failed because the account required a security code that only I knew. Vanessa had come within seconds of stealing every remaining dollar, but she had overlooked one protection I created years ago and completely forgot about. She still believed the money belonged to her. She had no idea that her own greed had become her biggest mistake. As everyone in the room began preparing the next legal steps, my phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown overseas number. There were only 6 words on the screen. Dad, please do not stop looking. Read those words again and again, because for the first time since Michael disappeared, I no longer heard the voice of a thief. I heard the frightened voice of my son. The next message we received included a location, and I knew the moment had finally come to face both Michael and Vanessa. The location appeared on my phone only a few minutes before sunrise. It was a small coastal town thousands of miles from home. The investigators immediately confirmed that the message had been sent from a public internet terminal less than 10 minutes earlier. That meant Michael had been alive only moments before he reached out to me. I did not hesitate. I boarded the first available flight with my attorney and 2 investigators. Every hour felt like a lifetime. As the plane crossed the ocean, I kept replaying every memory of my son in my mind. Remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle, the day he graduated from college, and the promise I made to his mother that I would always protect him. No matter how much he had hurt me, he was still my son. When we finally arrived, the local authorities escorted us to an old warehouse near the harbor. They believed Vanessa had been using it as a temporary meeting place. When the officers forced the door open, the building was completely silent. Tables were covered with financial records, fake passports, and stacks of legal documents, but there was no sign of Vanessa. Then, one officer called my name from the back of the warehouse. I ran toward him and found Michael sitting on the cold concrete floor. His face was bruised, his clothes were dirty, and he looked as though he had not slept for days. The moment he saw me, he slowly stood up. Before I could say a single word, he fell to his knees and began crying. Dad, I am so sorry. I believed her. I destroyed everything you spent your life building, and I do not deserve your forgiveness. Hearing those words broke something inside me. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. I thought I would shout at him. I thought I would ask him why he betrayed me. But when I looked into his eyes, I did not see a criminal. I saw a broken son who finally understood the price of his choices. Just as I took one step toward him, one of the investigators shouted, "Everybody move!" A side door slammed open, and Vanessa had returned. She was not alone. The next few seconds became the most dangerous moments of my entire life, and they would decide whether my son lived or died. The moment Vanessa stepped through the warehouse door, every police officer raised their weapon and ordered her not to move. She looked around the room, then smiled as if she had already accepted the situation. "So, this is how it ends," she quietly said. Michael slowly stood beside me, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was no longer protecting her. He was afraid of her. Vanessa reached into her handbag, and for one terrifying second, everyone believed she was reaching for a weapon. Instead, she slowly pulled out a small flash drive and held it above her head. "Everything is on this drive," she said. "Every transfer, every fake company, every passport, and every person who helped us. If I go down, I will not be alone." The investigators ordered her to place it on the ground. She laughed and looked directly at Michael. "You really believed I loved you? You were never my partner. You were only the key that opened your father's fortune." Those words hit Michael harder than anything else. He lowered his head and quietly began to cry. I had never seen my son look so completely broken. He finally understood that the woman he chose over his own family had never cared about him at all. Vanessa tried to step backward toward the open door, but the officers surrounded her before she could escape. With nowhere left to run, she threw the flash drive onto the floor and whispered, "Take it. It will not save your family." One investigator quickly secured the evidence while another placed Vanessa under arrest, and she was led away. She turned toward Michael one final time. "You lost your father for nothing," she coldly said. Michael collapsed into a chair, covered his face with both hands, and sobbed like the little boy I remembered. Walked over to him and stood in silence for several seconds. Finally, he looked up at me with tears running down his face. "Dad, I do not expect forgiveness. I only wanted one chance to tell you that I am sorry." I took a deep breath because this was the moment I had imagined ever since he disappeared with my fortune. The anger inside me was still real, but so was the love I had carried for him since the day he was born. As I looked into my son's eyes, I realized the hardest decision of my life was still waiting for me. Would I forgive him, or would I walk away forever? I looked into my son's eyes, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I did not see the man who stole $68 million from me. I saw the frightened little boy who used to run into my arms after making a mistake and hope I would still love him. My heart wanted to forgive him immediately, but my mind reminded me of every sleepless night, every employee who feared losing a job, and every promise he had broken. I slowly helped him to his feet and said, "Michael, I still love you because nothing can change the fact that you are my son, but loving you does not erase what you have done." He lowered his head and quietly nodded. "I know. Dad, I will accept whatever happens next." Those words told me he had finally stopped running. The investigators informed us that Vanessa had been taken into custody along with the evidence on the flash drive. The files exposed an international fraud network, and because Michael agreed to cooperate immediately, the authorities were able to freeze most of the remaining money before it disappeared forever. Over the following months, millions of dollars were successfully recovered, and every employee at my company kept their job. That mattered more to me than the money itself. Michael pleaded guilty to his crimes and accepted full responsibility before the court. He never blamed Vanessa for his own choices. He told the judge, "She manipulated me, but I still made the decision. I betrayed the only man who never betrayed me." Hearing those words was painful, but they were honest. After the hearing, I visited him before he was taken away. He looked at me through tears and whispered, "Dad, thank you for coming." I placed my hand on his shoulder and answered, "Forgiveness is not something you receive in a single day. It is something you earn one honest step at a time. When you come home, if you truly become a different man, we will start again as father and son." He cried harder than I had ever seen before. Months later, I walked through my company without anger for the first time since everything happened. The money had returned little by little, but I had learned something far more valuable. Never let wealth become more important than wisdom, and never mistake blind trust for love. I still pray for my son every single night because families are not destroyed in one moment, and sometimes they are rebuilt one painful step at a time. I thought losing $68 million would be the greatest tragedy of my life, but I eventually learned that the greatest victory was getting my son back before I lost him forever. Several months after the trial, I finally walked back into my office without feeling the weight of anger on my shoulders. The company was alive again. Our employees were smiling, the trucks were moving, and the phones never stopped ringing. Little by little, we recovered most of what had been stolen, but something inside me had changed forever. I no longer measured success by the number of dollars in my bank account. I measured it by the people who stood beside me when everything fell apart. One afternoon, I opened the top drawer of my desk and found the small toy truck Michael had given me on my 50th birthday. He had written a note on the bottom that said, "Dad, I hope one day I make you as proud as you make me." I sat there holding that little truck for several minutes with tears in my eyes, because I realized something important. My son had not been born a thief. He became a man who made terrible choices, and those choices almost destroyed both of us. A few weeks later, I received my first handwritten letter from him. He wrote every word himself. There were no excuses, no complaints, and no requests for money. He simply apologized again and thanked me for visiting him when nobody else did. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "Dad, I finally understand that you spent your whole life building the company because you loved me. Not because you loved money. I was too blind to see it." I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the photograph of our family that once sat in his office. I still carried the scars of his betrayal, and perhaps I always would. But I also knew hatred would only create another broken generation. If my late wife had been sitting beside me that day, she would have reminded me that real fathers never stop hoping. As I looked out of my office window, I quietly whispered, "When you come home, Michael, you will not inherit my fortune. First, you will have to earn my trust." Again. For the first time in many months, I felt peace instead of pain. And I knew my story was no longer about losing $68 million. It was about finding the strength to rebuild a family that almost disappeared forever. If you think this story ended with the courtroom, the final chapter taught me the greatest lesson of my entire life. 6 months passed before I saw Michael again. He had changed in ways I never expected. His shoulders were lower, his voice was quieter. And for the first time since he was a little boy, he looked at me with complete honesty instead of confidence. We sat across from each other in the visitors' room without speaking for nearly a minute. Finally, he reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "Dad, I wrote down every mistake I made because I never want to forget how easily pride destroyed my life." Unfolded the pages. They were filled from top to bottom. There was no blaming Vanessa, no blaming greed, and no blaming bad luck. The first sentence simply read, "Every terrible decision began the moment I stopped listening to my father." I felt tears filling my eyes, because those words were worth more than every dollar we had recovered. Michael then looked at me and quietly said, "I know I can never ask for the bow company. I can never ask for your money. I only hope that one day you might call me your son again." For several seconds, I could not answer. I remembered teaching him to throw a baseball, watching him graduate, and holding his hand at his mother's funeral. That boy was still somewhere. Inside the man sitting in front of me, he had buried him beneath lies, greed, and terrible choices, but perhaps he had not disappeared forever. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Michael, you stopped being worthy of my trust the day you chose money over family, but you never stopped being my son. The road back will be long, and you will have to earn every step of it. But I will never stop praying that you become the man your mother believed you would be." He lowered his head and quietly cried. Neither of us spoke again, until the guard announced that visiting time was over. As I stood to leave, Michael whispered, "Dad, thank you for giving me hope when I deserved none." I walked out of that building with a heart that still carried pain. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I also carried hope. When I returned to the company the following week, a surprise waiting on my desk reminded me that some wounds heal, while others leave lessons that last forever. When I returned to my office the following Monday, my assistant quietly placed a small sealed envelope on my desk. There was no return address and no company logo, only my name was written across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. It was Michael's. I slowly opened the envelope expecting another apology, but instead I found a single photograph. It showed the two of us standing beside the very first truck I had ever purchased. He was only 10 years old, sitting on the hood with the biggest smile I had ever seen. On the back of the photograph he had written, "Dad, this was the day you told me that a good name is worth more than any fortune. Forgot your lesson?" But I never forgot that day. I held that photograph for several minutes before placing it inside my desk drawer. Next to it was another folded page. This time it was not about regret. It was a list of every employee whose job had been placed at risk because of his actions. Beside every name, Michael had written a personal apology. He remembered their birthdays, their children, and even the years they had worked beside me. As I finished reading, I realized something important. He was finally seeing the people behind the numbers. The company had never been about trucks, buildings, or bank accounts. It had always been about families depending on honest work. That afternoon, I gathered every employee together and told them the truth. I did not hide my pain, and I did not make excuses for my son. I simply thanked every one of them for standing beside me when walking away would have been easier. They answered with a standing ovation. That lasted several minutes, and I struggled to hold back my tears. At that moment, I understood that loyalty could never be bought with millions. had to be earned through years of honesty and respect. As everyone returned to work, my attorney quietly walked into my office carrying a new document. He smiled for the first time in months and said, "John, we finally received the court's decision regarding the remaining frozen assets." I looked at him without speaking because I knew whatever he said next would decide the future of everything. I had spent my life building. The judge's final ruling was about to change my family's future one last time. The morning of the final court hearing, I walked into the courtroom carrying no anger and no expectations. Had spent months believing that winning back the money would somehow erase the pain. But I had finally learned that no amount of money could buy back lost trust. The judge carefully reviewed every report, the international investigation, the recovered assets, and the evidence found on Vanessa's devices. After nearly an hour, he looked directly at me and quietly said, "Mr. Carter, the court has ordered that every recoverable asset connected to this fraud be returned to its lawful owner." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I was celebrating, but because I finally felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. Most of the $68 million had been recovered, and the remaining losses were covered. Through seized property and insurance, the company would survive. Every employee would keep their job. My family's legacy would not disappear because of one terrible betrayal. As I walked out of the courtroom, my attorney handed me the official papers and smiled. "John, you have your company back." I looked at the documents for only a second before closing the folder. "No," I quietly replied. "Today, I got something much more valuable. I got my peace back." A few hours later, I made the hardest business decision of my life. I rewrote my entire estate plan, not because I wanted to punish Michael forever, but because I wanted to protect him from ever making the same mistake again. The company would never again depend on one person's signature or blind trust. Every major decision would require independent oversight and multiple approvals. Had learned that love should never replace wisdom. That evening, I stood alone inside the warehouse where my dream had first begun. I placed my hand on the old truck that started everything and whispered, "We made it." For the first time in many months, I smiled without forcing it. I knew my story was almost over, but one final conversation still remained. The next person I needed to see was not my attorney, not the judge, and not the investigators. It was my son. When Michael finally walked back into my life one last time, he gave me something that was worth far more than $68 million. The day Michael finally walked back into my office after serving his sentence, I looked at him for a long time before either of us spoke. He looked older than his years. His confidence was gone, and in its place was something I had not seen in a very long time. Humility. He slowly walked toward my desk and placed a small wooden box in front of me. "Dad, I made this myself," he whispered. "It is not expensive, but it is the first thing I have built with honest hands since I lost everything." I opened the box and found my old pocket watch inside, the same watch my father had given me when I started my business nearly 50 years earlier. Had believed it was gone forever, Michael quietly said. "I found it among the things Vanessa tried to sell. I bought it back with the money I earned while rebuilding my life. I wanted the first thing I returned to you to be part of our family's history." For a moment, I could not speak. I stood up, walked around my desk, and hugged my son for the first time since the day he disappeared with $68 million. We both cried without saying a word because some emotions are too deep for language. After several minutes, I looked at him and said, "Michael, I cannot change what happened, and neither can you, but every sunrise gives us another chance to become better than we were yesterday." He nodded with tears in his eyes and answered, "Dad, I do not want your fortune anymore. I only want to earn your respect again." Those words were worth more to me than every dollar that had ever passed through my company. Smiled and pointed toward the warehouse. "Then, let us begin where we started. You will not return as the owner's son. You will return as the newest employee." Michael smiled through his tears and quietly replied, "I would be honored." As I watched him walk across the warehouse floor greeting employees one by one, I realized something I had never understood before. A fortune can be stolen. Company can be rebuilt. Even trust can slowly return if both hearts are willing to do the work. But time with the people you love is the one treasure that never comes back. If my story has taught you anything, I hope it is this: never choose money over family, because wealth may change your lifestyle, but character decides your legacy. In the end, I did not win because I recovered $68 million. I won because I refused to let betrayal turn my heart into something my son would never recognize, and that is the story I wanted to leave behind. Thank you for listening.